Hey guys, it's the Melblade 5. I think I speak for everyone when I say I was caught off guard by the beginning of that Nintendo Direct when they revealed a new mainline Fire Emblem game. Fire Emblem Engage. But what I can't say for everybody is how I was caught off guard in other ways too. Never has the announcement of a Fire Emblem game left me with far more fears than things to be excited about. Numerous parts of what was shown, and even little things like the name, made it feel more like a spin-off than a mainline game. The summoning characters from previous games element was just ripped from Heroes, and after I eventually stopped playing Heroes due to everything about becoming infuriating to follow, I certainly didn't appreciate it influencing the main series. The story appeared to just be a rehash of Shadow Dragons with copies of the Risen thrown in there, which left me fearing that the story would be very basic, which in turn could cause the writing and characters to be basic too. And what bothered me the most from the trailers, I hated the art style and most of the character designs. And I thought Shez looked like a DeviantArt OC. I should have saved that joke for later. Ew! Dude! What the fuck? Safe to say, it wasn't what I was hoping for from the next game in the series. It also didn't help that almost all of Engage's marketing was only in Japanese, which I couldn't understand. In English, we just had a handful of trailers that didn't give me much more to go off of to help alleviate those fears. I refrained from saying all this at the time because everyone else's reactions were overwhelmingly positive, and I know from personal experience that going against the grain by being negative results in you getting a ton of shit. When all that time, I honestly was not looking forward to this game. In fact, I was borderline dreading its release. Then as the release date came and reactions and reviews continued to be as positive as before, I did what I knew I was inevitably going to do. Cave in and buy the game anyway. At least to give it a chance to see if maybe playing it myself could cheer me around on my initial impressions. And after playing through the game and finishing it over the course of a month, I'd say my current feelings on Engage are very conflicted. I knew one way or another I was going to make a video discussing my thoughts on this game after beating it. So now it's just a matter of expressing those thoughts on the parts that ended up being better than what I expected, and those that did not. So getting my most jarring issue out of the way first, I still hate how this game looks. Graphically speaking, it definitely looks better than Three Houses, and the cinematics are clean as fuck. What I hate about the visuals is, again, the art style. I've never been a fan of that overly cutesy anime look you see on things like VTubers, so seeing it used for Fire Emblem was always going to rub me up the wrong way, but it was made worse for me by just how much they committed to it. Fire Emblem has always had an anime-inspired look, but across all of its previous art styles, they were still grounded, in that they were still designed to fit the medieval fantasy setting. But for Engage, they just went full-on anime, and thus the characters do not look like they belong in the world they've been placed into, nor fit the tone of fighting in a war, due to how ridiculous and outlandish they look. I'd say that Diamant has my favorite design out of all the new characters, cause on top of just looking really cool, his design feels the most like a Fire Emblem character, as opposed to a Genshin Impact reject. But even the designs that I'd say I like overall, such as Ivy's, do have a few details here and there that I'm not a fan of to make me nitpick, like her fascinator that only exists to obstruct her vision. Then among the many designs I dislike, most famously is Alir's toothpaste hair, which is precisely why I named him Colgate in my playthrough. Tamara looks like she got a bunch of balls from the McDonald's play pit stuck to her. Sailing's dress is absolutely ridiculous. Marin is dressed like a furry. Am I the only one who thinks Boucheron's head looks tiny compared to the rest of his body? And the girls with face paint are the designs that bug me the most, because it contributes to them looking even more out of place, and even more like VTubers. I felt so alienated by so many of these designs that it genuinely killed my immersion whenever I looked at them while playing, as my mind would automatically mull over all my complaints with them. I know I'm letting this bother me way more than it should, since it doesn't affect the important parts of the game, but I can't help but feel this way regardless. As for that important stuff, and the area that everybody is raving about the most, the gameplay. At its core, it's still the same Fire Emblem gameplay you've come to expect, so no issues there. They brought back the weapon triangle too, which I appreciate since I wasn't a fan of its removal in free houses, but they added a new break mechanic onto it, where attacking an enemy while having advantage will cause them to be unable to counterattack until after the next time they're fought. Which is something I'm not really huge on, since I think it's a bit too exploitable. Both from how piss easy it is to achieve, and how it removes all challenge from fighting that enemy. Granted, it didn't end up being as exploitable as I initially thought it would, but I still found it to be a fairly prevalent scenario. And while enemies can break you, I rarely ever had this happen to me outside of the annoying fracture staff that they don't even know how to use properly. Similarly, they also added a smash mechanic, where using a heavy weapon will knock the enemy back a space at the cost of letting them attack first. I hardly ever use this cause I found attacking last to be too big of a drawback, and pushing them away more often messed with my strategies rather than helped them. The only times I consistently used it was with Ike's hammer, and I used that weapon purely for the armor slayer effect. And on the subject of weapons, they removed weapon durability again. I didn't like when they did this in Fates, and I still don't like it here. Durability always helped to provide some additional strategy through managing your weapon usage. For example, holding off on using your stronger weapons that have less uses unless it's vital. But here, I could just go to town with the stronger weapons and tear through most enemies with the characters on my team with no repercussions. The weapons you use do affect your stats like in Fates, but I found the stat differences to be so minimal that it didn't matter. I can count the number of times I bought a weapon from the armory on one hand because I didn't have an incentive to buy many weapons when they don't break. These aren't major issues for me, but they aren't to my preference either. Now for the biggest new addition in Engage's gameplay, the emblems. Apparitions of characters from all the previous games that when equipped to a unit improve their performance in battle and grants them a bunch of skills specific to that emblem. Then when your unit's engage meter is full, they can engage with the emblem. God, the terminology in this game is so cheesy. Which has them transform for the next 3 turns to gain access to stronger weapons and even more abilities depending on which emblem they're equipped with. Including the engage attack they can use once per transformation that I mainly use to destroy bosses. I think this mechanic is a lot of fun to strategize around, from deciding how and when best to use every facet of an emblem's capabilities, knowing when to engage, and finding which combinations of emblems and units work best. Plus, units can inherit skills from emblems they have bonded with to possess said skills even when they aren't equipped with them. While giving me some unsavory reminders of heroes, this feature opened a ton of doors for me to better optimize my team to make each unit the best I felt they could be. More so than what I typically do on my first playthroughs. I also love how they managed to include references to each emblem's original game through their abilities. Like how Sigurd grants you more movement to reference how massive the maps were in Genealogy, or Celica making you lose a small amount of health when using a tome, since that's how magic worked in Gaiden and Echoes. That sense of nostalgia also came into play from how each emblem has their own paralogue that recreates a chapter from their game, acting as one long trip down memory lane for me. But while I really like the emblem and engage features from a mechanical standpoint, being a power-up of sorts for more options, I do think that the concept of having it be tied to summoning the heroes from past games is very gimmicky. I love the nostalgia that came with them, but I do find it to be very forced on all fronts. I've seen many people try to excuse this by saying it's an anniversary title, forgetting that Awakening took a similar approach, but its callbacks to past games were through mechanics and homages to what came before, or being a continuation of those elements in the case of Adult Tiki, not by having the characters straight up appear exactly as they were in their games, outside of DLC. If Engage had done that instead, I think it would have achieved the same goal while feeling natural, as opposed to it looking like they're using nostalgia more for marketing purposes rather than purely for fun fan service. The same goes for this game's DLC being primarily more emblems, which I do like seeing more characters in here when we're already stuck with the cameo approach, but does add to that gimmicky feel. And the other thing about emblems themselves that irks me all the way back to Engage's reveal The focus being almost entirely on them meant that the new characters would never get the chance to stand out on their own, and by being forced to share the spotlight, they could easily get overshadowed by them. So did that end up happening? Well, yes and no. Before I talk about the characters, I need to put up a giant asterisk for this whole section stating, from what I saw in my playthrough. Cause I wouldn't be surprised if this was also like Fates by having their more interesting qualities, if any, be locked behind very specific and remote support conversations that I just haven't seen yet. A good chunk of the new characters I did end up really liking, with the aforementioned Diamant and Ivy being among my favorites. And alongside them, I found Alchrist's low self-esteem to be relatable. Lapis I thought was enjoyably peppy without being overbearing, while also being hard on herself at times to make me empathize with her. Kagetsu gives me slight Owain and La Rochelle vibes, which is always a positive, but has many of his own funny traits too. Yeah, it was mainly most of the Brodian characters and about half the Illusians who really struck a chord with me. But on the other hand, there are plenty of characters who devolve into repeating one or two traits ad nauseum, even across their supports without much being built upon them. Like, there are 3 characters introduced back to back whose main characteristic is just muscles! This same kind of sentiment also applies to my opinion on Alear, as I found their character to be a repeat of Corrin, wherein I find them pretty bland. So this game's characters ended up feeling like a mixed bag, again from what I've seen. And after Free Houses did such an amazing job at fleshing out most of its characters, and even this game doing a pretty good job for some of them through their supports, it bums me out that this doesn't seem to apply to everyone. Likewise, I had a similar issue with the bond conversations between a unit and Emblem, as all the C and B ranks are just 2 lines of dialogue. It's only in the A ranks that they say anything remotely noteworthy. I would have much preferred if they took Free Hopes' support approach, where not every combination has a conversation, but those who do have ones that are more like proper supports to allow both characters' personalities to shine. Instead of it being so minimal like, I like your shoes. Thanks. Then there's everything else you can do around the Somniel, which is basically a more condensed Garreg Mach. Which I guess is an improvement, cause I never had an issue roaming around Garreg Mach like everyone else who talks about this game seemed to. But what I do think is a bit of a downgrade is how some of the activities, while fine on their own, feel like they don't serve much purpose. Some of the attractions, like fishing and wyvern ride, often didn't give a good enough reward for me to find them worthwhile. I went from doing everything other than sleeping and the Tower of Trials that was currently available in the Somniel between each chapter near the beginning, to finding them a waste of time and mostly ignoring them towards the end as I just wanted to get to the next chapter. Besides Sami, because I couldn't bring myself to neglect him, outside of him and the Ring Chamber, the only activities I remained to always do were the cooking, the arena, recreational spots once those were patched in, and Wii Fit. And that one was still stretching for time a little. Unlike Free Houses, where I thought everything you could do at Garreg Mach served a genuine purpose in regards to combat or supports that I had no issue with doing them every time. Now with everything else covered, all that remains is the story. And sadly, my fears for it ended up being completely true. This game's story is so basic and uninteresting that it became my biggest gripe with it alongside the art style. It's basically just a glorified fetch quest to collect the 12 rings in order to defeat Sombron, who stole the Fell Dragon title from Grima. So much of the plot progression is just going from one place to the next to get more rings, while the second half adds in a bunch of repeated fights against the 4 Hounds, who are like discount versions of the 4 Fangs from Blazing Blade. Then my issues with the story itself mostly falls into 3 categories. One was simply how many moments were so predictable to me. Literally, the second time you see Vale, I thought, she's gonna turn out to be evil, since she had a knack for always showing up where there were a ton of bad guys. And oh look, I was right! I also correctly guessed that Alear was her sibling as soon as the missing sibling bit came up, which in turn caused me to see the huge, shocking twist of Alear being Sombron's child coming from light years away. So it became a matter of when they were going to reveal these twists, rather than having any surprise at the twist like they intended. Though in that last one, Gris just casually says the twist at the beginning of the chapter. Meaning even the game undermines the big twist by the time you get to the dramatic reveal. The only time I was surprised and invested was in Chapter 10 when all the emblems you've gathered so far are taken and corrupted by Sombron to serve him instead, forcing you to start over with just Lyn and Lucina. Something unexpected happened with dire consequences that stood as a lasting challenge for the heroes from then on. I liked that! I just wish there was more of that, as it leads to the second category, being how it's a simple story that plays out in a simple manner for the most part. There aren't many dramatic moments or character conflicts outside of that moment, and when there are, they usually cut short rather than giving them the time to develop that I think they should have. All the while, we get the occasional lore of what happened in the war against Sombron 1,000 years ago, which sounds way more interesting. It's like a tease, as it left me thinking the story would have been a lot better if it was set then. Even Pastelier, in just the one chapter where you go to the past, is a way more interesting character than the present one. Why couldn't this be the version I was following around? And third, I think the villains suck. When it comes to the Hounds, Mauvir ends up being the Jafar of the four and becomes an ally, definitely making him the most developed of the group, even though his demeanor remains mostly apathetic.
I have no strong feelings one way or the other.
Marnie acts like an obnoxious brat until they try giving her a sad backstory 5 minutes before she's killed. Meanwhile, Gris is just a masochist. And as for Zephyr, she spends the whole game staying fully loyal to Sombron and committing purely evil acts as a generic henchwoman, only to then help you after being defeated for the final time. Cause all this time, she just wanted a family, which comes completely out of the blue. Now it seems they're copying Hero's writing of giving many of the villains forced sympathetic motives, often at the last minute, in an attempt to make them tragic, but end up making them look bipolar. If they had done more with the idea of the Hounds acting like a family throughout the game, and not had Zephyr act in ways that clearly contradict her true feelings, then I could have given a shit about them instead of being really confused by the sudden change in personality. Lastly, Sombron's personality is just being generically evil with a generic goal of wanting to conquer all worlds. He doesn't even get much screen time either, despite being the main villain. And most of that is just him standing around talking to Zephyr. So it doesn't leave much of an impression to make up for it in the way I felt Grima did. They do reveal his backstory in the final chapter of him being from another world and how he was exiled to Elios where he was eventually left all alone. But like with the Dead Hounds, I think it's too little, too late to make him interesting. But since his dragon form looks like a snake, all the Heroes players will simp for him anyway. Of course, gameplay is the most important part of a game, which Engage does succeed in, but since most Fire Emblem games have at least decent stories, I come to highly value that aspect too, especially after Three Houses did an exceptional job with its story as a whole. So having that followed up by Engage falling very short in that area irks me even more. With the build up to the climax having Alear die protecting the Good Veil, allowing Sombron to use the rings, again, then they're revived as a corrupted, only to die, again, only to immediately be revived, again, this time as an emblem.
Making you the 13th emblem, the Fire Emblem.
Oh, fuck off! And after another fetch quest to destroy the dragon shards, you reach the final battle where Sombron summons dark emblems of the main villains / final bosses from all the previous games. I thought this was really cool, getting to see them appear too and adding some epic and nostalgic feel to the last chapter. Though it's a shame that this idea couldn't have come up throughout the game instead of only at the end, and that we don't even get to actually see them or get voiced lines when they recite their death quotes. Eventually, Sombron is slain, and with his death, all the emblems disappear, bringing the game to an end. I swear, I've gone through over a dozen different attempts at rounding up my thoughts on Engage in my mind, and I'm still struggling to decide on a de facto conclusion. When it comes to the most important, fundamental parts of a game, it's good. So I'd say the game is good, as I did have a lot of fun playing it. And I really like some of the characters, who hurt their backs carrying my investment in this game from the more narrative side. However, there are also multiple areas where I felt Engage took a step back compared to previous games, in addition to having a few small gripes with the gameplay, which did leave me with a sense of disappointment and slight irritation too. Even with me loving the callbacks and fan service, I'm not going to let nostalgia blind me from having some notable issues with the game. So I can't really figure out which side of the spectrum I lean towards. As soon as I think of something going in one direction, I'm reminded of something else that pulls me back the opposite way. It's an almost love-hate relationship. I'm probably going to get a ton of shit here by being more critical of this game than the average person, but I don't want to fake my opinions for the sake of fitting in and getting more likes. Otherwise, I'd just be a sellout. Besides, I've been uncool my entire life, so I don't see why I should try to be now. All I can hope for at this point is for the next game to satisfy my tastes in the three things I value with every Fire Emblem game: gameplay, story, and characters. Now, if you excuse me, I have a bunker to hide in.